I'm Fitz, and I'm on staff at the Study Center. And on behalf of Bill Wilder, the executive director who couldn't be here tonight, he's sick, and the whole CCS team, I wanted to offer my welcome. Thank you also to our co-sponsors, the National Marriage Project on the one hand, and also InterVarsity Grad and Faculty Ministries, with whom we planned this university faculty lecture series that started with Angel Parham in the fall, and includes this talk and also a talk by John Owen in April 11th, that's going to be entitled, What's Wrong with Democracy? That also a title that will catch you. What's Wrong with Democracy? Three answers, no consensus. So mark your calendars for that one. And so this is a series of talks, and this fits within a series, and our goal for this series is to highlight the good work that Christian faculty at UVA are doing. And we're saying that because we're Christians, we care about learning itself. We care about good learning. And we don't need to do Christianity and blank in order to care about it. We really care that learning is happening well and is being done well here. And so we're presenting a Christian faculty lecture series with that in mind. While I'm doing business matters at the tail end of that, hopefully people, this is a hard turn, hopefully people received Valentine's as you came in. That Valentine is a tongue-in-cheek way of getting you to register. And there is further incentive to register attendance for tonight, which is we're giving away some swag. We have a Study Center mug that we're going to give away at the end of the time. And so if you want to register with QR and your phone, you will get entered for a raffle for that mug. So that's our business stuff. On for the talk for tonight, in which, in our talk, Brad has promised us 3 easy steps to meet your soulmate. Get married, be happy. Maybe not. No. Maybe that's not the plan. No. But more seriously, there is all this data out there right now that says, how happy do people report being in a marriage? If it's broken down by where a couple met. Did they meet at church? Did they meet online? Did they meet at a bar? And there's data about how happy do people report being who decided to put family ahead of work in their lives, or the other way, work ahead of family. How happy they report being in their lives. So there's all this information out there. We've got lots of data. But this data needs interpreting. What does it mean for us? How do we make sense of it? And that's why I'm glad to have Brad Wilcox here with us tonight to present on some of this data and also to make sense of it for us. And Brad is a UVA alum, and he's professor of sociology here at UVA, and he's director of the National Marriage Project. And he's the author of many books and articles, too many for me to name for you, but I will give you the name of his forthcoming book, which is due out this summer, which is Get Married. How about that for a title? It was the publisher who did it, but it's a wonderful title. Please join me in welcoming Brad.
Thanks, Fitz, for that gracious and fun introduction. I'd also like to thank the Center for Christian Study for hosting not just my lecture, but John's lecture coming up later on this semester, and for my colleagues' lecture, Angel Parham's lecture just a little bit ago. I'm grateful to the Center for being a source of community for faculty and staff and students and townfolk here at the University of Virginia and Charlottesville more generally. We're grateful for the community that you bring to the Christian community here in Charlottesville. So I'm here tonight to talk about love, sex, and faith. But before I kind of get started on that particular subject or those sets of subjects, I wanted just to kind of ask the folks here to kind of give me a quick show of hands. Who here would like to be happy? Just raise your hand if you'd like to be happy. Okay, so it's a pretty common sentiment here. And of course, you're not alone. Ours is a nation dedicated, as Jefferson wrote in the Declaration, of course, to the pursuit of happiness. This pursuit has been and remains fundamental to the American experience. But lately, we've not been having as much success when it comes to fostering happiness here in America. This Gallup poll that's referenced is kind of documenting how American happiness has been hitting kind of record lows in our day. And perhaps we're kind of chasing the wrong things in this culture. And as I've been kind of thinking about this, I've been thinking about kind of a lot of the sentiments that I hear articulated by UVA students in terms of their aspirations, their goals, and their expectations. And I love my students here at UVA. They're hardworking, they're gracious, they're polite, but I do have kind of like this sense that they're focused more on what has been called by David Brooks resume virtues. and resume virtues rather than eulogy virtues. And what David Brooks is kind of getting at is that virtues like ambition and hard work connected to things like education, work, and money are kind of more likely to be salient for UVA students as compared to kind of the eulogy virtues, things like loyalty, kindness, and gratitude we'd associate with family and with friendship. Being a reliable friend, being a great boyfriend, being a good daughter. And as I've been kind of talking to UVA students, I'll get sentiments like this one expressed by Holly, a former student of mine here at UVA. She said this: UVA students are definitely more focused on their education and getting their career started than getting into a serious relationship, said Holly. If it happens, great, but the focus is definitely on building our own brands first. Basically, the thought process is relationships and love are risk, but you always have your career and success to fall back on, at least while you are young. Okay, so this is kind of a view articulated by Holly, and it's indicative, again, of the way in which a lot of folks think that the pursuit of happiness runs toward things that you can count here at UVA. And UVA students are by no means alone in this sentiment. When you kind of look at polling data from Pew, for instance, what you see is that many Americans think that education, work, and money end up being a lot more important for their happiness and fulfillment than things like marriage and parenthood. Okay, so this is kind of like a common mindset here in the US more generally. So I'm going to kind of just ask all of you for a second here, if you want to just kind of weigh in, maybe one or two members of the audience want to weigh in on this question. Why is it that young adults are kind of privileging, again, what I'm calling resume virtues over eulogy virtues? Kind of what's your perspective on that question? Any brave souls here tonight? Yes, Peter.
Probably because they think that resume virtues are things that give them more liberty, afford them more choices in life, where a lot of the eulogy virtues involve commitment, which they might see as binding or limiting.
Okay, so there could be a way in which a sort of a spirit of freedom or individuality is associated with these resume virtues, kind of keeping your options open in today's cultural context, okay? Other thoughts on this question? Yes, ma'am.
I think the general life path seems to be like getting your education, then getting a job, and once that's settled, then like settling down. So I think that's just like the path that people see.
So part of it is that we kind of have shifted from seeing marriage in kind of a cornerstone model where you kind of get married in your early 20s and then move on to a more capstone model where folks want to get all of their ducks in a row in terms of education, work, and life before going on to marriage. But I think it's also the case, too, that the kind of messaging that our students and our young adults are getting more generally from professors, from peers, and from parents is a lot more focused these days on what Kay Heimatz calls kind of the big career, rather than on sort of thinking about finding a loyal and a loving spouse. So again, kind of the ambient culture is pointing a lot of young adults, like many of the folks here, towards thinking about and prioritizing education and work over marriage and family. And it's this kind of cultural emphasis that I think helps to explain why marriage has fallen more than 60% in terms of the rates of marriage from 1970 to our current moment. And also why we're kind of projecting moving forward that about 1 in 3 young adults kind of this age will not get married in America. And this is going to be kind of like record territory for us in terms of the folks who are going to be permanent bachelors or bachelorettes. So this is kind of the ambient culture's perspective. But what does the data say to us about the relationship, the link between these sort of resume virtues and these eulogy virtues, vis-a-vis education, work, and marriage, for instance? So it is true that being college educated boosts your happiness by about 64%. Compared to being less educated in the US. So that's kind of, something in favor of education. And being employed boosts your happiness by about 32% compared to not working. And having an above average income boosts your happiness by about 88%. So these kinds of statistics tell us that yes, it is the case. It is true that education, work, and money for many ordinary Americans are linked to more happiness, to more meaning and direction in life as well. But what we also see in the data is that being married boosts your happiness by 151% in the data. And then we turn to one particular feature of married life. We see that being happily married boosts it by 545%, okay? And I was talking about this statistic to someone who kind of works in a nonprofit in Texas a few weeks ago, and mentioning that this is kind of like the strongest factor that I've seen predicting happiness as I kind of crunch, the numbers. And his eyes just kind of bugged out. And I realized that, actually it's probably worth just underlining to folks, that again, when you kind of look at things like job satisfaction, when you look at things like self-reported health, when you look at even religious practice, you can throw any variable into the data set and then look at global life satisfaction. It's not going to be as powerful a predictor of global life satisfaction as this factor here. So it just kind of underlines how important and how fundamental this relationship is for a lot of folks, across the U.S. So again, the point here is that nothing predicts happiness in American life that I've run across like the quality of your marriage. So why is it that marriage and marriage-related factors are more important than education, work, and money? What's sort of the story here? Well, there's a lot we could say here, but I think it's worth bringing in Aristotle's perspective this evening. And he observed, of course, many, many years ago that man is by nature a social animal, okay? And so I think the point here in part is that our ties with others, with family and friends, end up being more important for us than these markers of status or accomplishment, things like education and work. And that's because our social ties give us opportunities to give and to receive from others, to love and to be loved by others. And they also give us opportunities to exercise particular virtues, virtues like generosity, virtues like loyalty, virtues like kindness that I think end up being more important for our long-term happiness than just virtues like ambition. So this suggests, I think, as well, that maybe excelling in virtue requires particular kinds of virtues. That means, particular kinds of habits, particular kinds of ideals, and a unique community to help us successfully navigate the challenges and opportunities of married life. So here I want to kind of stop again and ask a question or a set of questions to the audience here and think about this question. How do you think colleges are doing when it comes to equipping the next generation for marriage, one of the most important sources of happiness in life, compared to how they're doing when it comes obviously to education and professional preparation? What's your perspective on this set of questions? How does UVA do on the score in general, or colleges more generally? Yes, Peter.
I would say fairly poorly.
Fairly poorly, okay.
Are generally treated today more like trade schools in order to build resume virtues to get to a job rather than human information.
Right, so we're much more focused here at UVA kind of on the resume virtues rather than those other more humane virtues perhaps, okay? Any other thoughts on this question?
There's a lack of conversation going on about it. I mean, you go out into college and you can have a conversation with anyone just about anything, any academic field, but you don't really hear people talking about like marriage or family life or happiness unless you go to like certain specific classes where you
Right.
specifically curated classes.
Right. Okay, so you don't hear about it both kind of in the classroom context and then often kind of in a more informal social context on average at UVA. Okay, so there's kind of an absence, I would suggest to you tonight, and then there's, I think, sort of three ways in which many college campuses, including UVA, are kind of implicated in three mistakes that are, again, kind of part and parcel of the larger ambient culture and sort of filter into the way in which a lot of college students think about and approach young adult relationships and then kind of marriage later in life as well. So the first point I want to make is kind of about the way in which we often make mistakes about sort of how we think about, how we idealize what love is all about, including what marital love is about. And so what I think we often do is we kind of embrace what I call kind of the soulmate model of love. And this is a love to kind of quote from Eli Finkel, a psychologist at Northwestern, wants us to think about love in terms of, and marriage in terms of, something that promotes our hedonic well-being, kind of high pleasure to pain ratio that makes us feel good about ourselves, okay? And that also kind of assumes at some level that if you've got this sort of soulmate connection with someone, you've got this soulmate love with someone, then, sustaining a happy marriage shouldn't really require extensive endurance or forbearance, okay? If you're with your soulmate, things are gonna go pretty swimmingly, all of the time. That's kind of the assumption here. Of course, that's been how it has been for me and Danielle over the last 27 years, so she can attest to after the lecture. So what am I talking about, kind of in terms of real world terms? Well, if you kind of just turn on the radio or turn on Spotify, so to speak, or look at music videos, you kind of can get a sense for this more soulmate-y perspective. From 10,000 Hours by Justin Bieber to Ariana Grande's Imagine, or pop music, for instance, gives us a prominent platform for this more soulmate-y approach to love. You can listen to Justin crooning about spending, quote, 10,000 hours to learn that sweet heart of yours and singing love you, ooh, 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 as you watch him embrace his new wife, Haley, on a recent music video. So kind of an impossibly romantic, adult-centered understanding is being kind of propagated here, both in this video and this song, and obviously just tens of thousands of other songs and videos, movies, books that kind of make, this ideal popular for a lot of young adults and adults more generally. But I think this is a mistake in two ways. So in the first way, I think it's a mistake because it tends to minimize your odds of forging a lifelong marriage, because you think that kind of love is all about kind of the butterflies between two persons and having kind of this intense feeling of connection with this other person almost all the time. You're going to be in for, a lot of trouble in an ordinary marriage. And this kind of came through in an interview that a colleague did with a woman named Tanya in Ohio. And Tanya was leaving her husband and the father of her kids for a neighbor who was better at kind of generating the butterflies. She said this, I love him, but I'm not in love with him, Tanya said of her husband. I love him as a friend, as the father, but I don't feel that connection as I used to, like not at all. There's just a huge difference between loving somebody and being in love with somebody. Marriage depends on being in love, where you can't wait to be around them, you still get the butterflies. When they're at work, you can't wait to see them, can't wait till they come walking through the door. And her perspective is kind of not an outlier here in the sense that we also see in some survey data that we've collected here in California, for instance, that California husbands and wives who took kind of the more soulmate perspective here at the top of the screen, as compared to what I call kind of more of a family-first orientation at the bottom of the screen, were more likely to say that they have serious doubts that their marriage will last. So again, what I'm suggesting tonight is the soulmate perspective is more likely to be fragile because, again, feelings are kind of a fragile foundation for marital stability. But the second point that I want to make too is that I think the soulmate approach, which kind of often presumes you kind of can directly pursue happiness in your marriage and in your relationship, is a mistake because we know from the psychological literature that directly seeking one's own happiness, trying to sort of make oneself happy, or to be expecting that you're going to be happy in your relationship is kind of counterproductive. And we see instead is that people who try to make some kind of good outside of themselves, and it could be, a faith, it could be a political cause, or it could be, in this case, the good of one's spouse and one's kids and one's kin, generally are happier. Again, the point here is that sort of looking outside of yourself and seeking a good outside of oneself tends to end up making people more happy. And we see again in the research from California that I mentioned that folks who take the more family-first approach are generally happier than folks who have the more soulmate-y approach to married life. So again, looking outside of yourself and seeking these goods of marriage, classically understood goods like the welfare of your spouse, your kids, your kin, etc., is linked to not just more stable marriages, but I'm suggesting higher quality marriages. To kind of put this in more classical terms, we could end our sort of reflection on love by just sort of appreciating, as St. Thomas Aquinas did, that love is not a feeling. Okay? Love is not a feeling. It's not about the butterflies. It's about making a decision to seek the good of someone else, your spouse, your kids, and your kin, for instance, in the marriage and family contexts. Okay, so what's the sort of mistake that people often make in college and in the ambient culture around sex? Well, I think one of the mistakes that they make is kind of treating sex in too casual a spirit, and we associate that with kind of the hookup culture on college campuses. Now, it's important to sort of understand and to appreciate that in any given year today, actually most students are not going to be engaging in what's understood as a hookup, some kind of casual sexual encounter that's sort of not clearly defined. But over the course of their collegiate careers, the research suggests that between 40 and 64% of college students will be involved in one way or another in the hookup culture. And this makes sense, sociologically, because it allows folks to kind of, focus on their education and their professional future without becoming too tied down to someone, too committed to someone in their college career. It's kind of congruent with the erotic pop culture that surrounds us, on our television screens and our smartphones and on our musical playlists. It also, of course, kind of in the short term, delivers physical pleasure and social status to folks oftentimes, and it's sort of appealing in that way as well. And it's facilitated by alcohol. So why is alcohol kind of an important part of the hookup culture, would you say? What's sort of the story there? Why does alcohol figure so largely in the hookup culture here on grounds, for instance? Yes, ma'am.
I think it numbs senses and also increases risk taking.
Right, so alcohol just lowers our inhibitions, and yeah, it does exactly what you're saying. So that's why it's part and parcel of sort of how this plays out on college campuses. But the concern here that I have in part with this is that maybe treating others as objects of desire or conquest, apart from kind of a serious and committed relationship, doesn't always work out so well, at least for some folks. And I've got a story here about Heather. If you're in my class, you'll have to kind of bear with me again. I'm going to repeat this sort of Heather story. But it's about a young woman at UCLA, and she was seeking psychological help at the UCLA Student Health Center. And this is her story that kind of gives us a sense of how this can be more problematic in some cases. She's talking to a psychologist at UCLA. So as we spoke, Heather stressed that her moods really didn't make sense because life was good and there was nothing to complain about. Heather liked school and had many friends. Her family was supportive. She had enough money. Her health was fine. How long has this been going on? I asked. Oh, I don't know. Maybe, I guess, since the new year. I've always had low self-esteem, but now it's really bad. Did anything happen to you around that time? She thought about it. No, I don't think so. I can't think of anything. And there are times when symptoms may appear without any precipitant. But I decided to ask again. Heather, please think about it carefully. In the fall or early winter, did you lose somebody you love or have a pet die? Did you get through something frightening or dangerous? Did you enter or end a relationship? She thought it over. Well, I can think of one thing. Since Thanksgiving, I've had a friend with benefits. And actually, I'm kind of confused about that. Really? Tell me more. Well, I met him at a party and I really like him, but there's this problem. I want to spend more time with him and do stuff like go shopping or see a movie. That would make it a friendship for me. But he says no, because if we do those things, then in his opinion, we'd have a relationship. And that's more than he wants. And I'm confused, because it seems like I don't get the friend part, but he still gets the benefits. She was genuinely puzzled. She had no clue whatsoever. I think many people would feel the way you do, I told her. You're giving what he wants, but not getting what you want. Yes, she agreed. I'm really unhappy about that. It's hard to be with him and then go home and be alone. Okay, so this is kind of an example of the way in which this approach to relationships may have, obviously, some downsides, at least in the moment. But I also would think that perhaps there are ways in which kind of experiences like this, for people like Heather, could over time prove corrosive when it comes to their approach to love and marriage, or at least kind of cast a cloud of uncertainty or doubt about their ability to kind of trust or invest in a marriage longer term. And we do see, when we look at kind of how these patterns play out across the life course, that there is some pretty powerful associations between having, for instance, more partners and having a greater risk of divorce. So we can see here that folks who have more partners, particularly in more recent cohorts, that's in yellow, are more likely to get divorced, for instance. And it's kind of the same story when it comes to marital happiness. There's a pretty strong association here between having more partners and being less happy in your marriage. And what's also, I think, kind of striking here is that this relationship is true for both women in blue and for men here in yellow as well. And so part of the story here is, as Dr. Galena Rhodes at the University of Denver has suggested, is that there could be a way in which there's kind of a spirit of critical comparison that kicks in. So if you've been, with Will, who's really funny, and with Luke, who's really ambitious, and with David, who is really considerate, maybe your husband, is not quite as, good on those three different aspects. But, kind of his overall package was better. But again, kind of in the middle of married life, you might kind of have recourse to thinking about how your husband compares unfavorably to these three previous partners. Could be part of what's happening here. And then also she suggests too that having had more relationship experiences also gives you more experience kind of breaking up. And that could make you more likely, in the face of some kind of difficulty, to head for the exits, but also to be maybe perhaps a bit more cynical about love and relationships as well. So we don't know kind of like the precise mechanisms here, but we do just know that there is a way in which I think a kind of more casual approach to sex that's linked to more partnerships is at least associated with some pretty negative outcomes when it comes to marriage. So kind of more constructively, what I would say vis-a-vis sort of sex is to sort of take things more slowly and seriously. That moving more slowly gives folks an opportunity to see if they have a good friendship. That would be the foundation, the basis for a good marriage. And then also to kind of work on establishing communication, mutual trust, and a secure romantic attachment if they're kind of interested in heading towards marriage. Okay, so the third mistake that I think a lot of folks make when it comes to college and the early 20-something years more generally is that they tend to walk away from their faith, from their family of origin. And at some level, kind of you get it, right? Because particularly I think nowadays, no one wants to be kind of perceived as closed-minded and uptight, right? And that's how I think a lot of religious, folks are perceived in the broader culture. Again, closed-minded and uptight. And that's maybe putting it nicely. Another, of course, big dynamic here is that weekends are for fun. they're not for faith, right? You're supposed to be spending your weekend at Trinity on the corner, not Trinity Pres, right? That's kind of the assumption here, okay? I ask all my Trinity Pres, adherents to forgive me for that comment, okay? And this is certainly true for my first few years here at UVA. I was not involved in any kind of religious community as a first year, a second year, or as a third year, okay? Kind of had some of those assumptions sort of running around in my head in my early time at UVA. But maybe that's a mistake, right? Because if we are social animals, as Aristotle said, maybe hanging out with folks who take sex, love, and marriage kind of seriously would be maybe good for us, perhaps. And I'm thinking here in part of the sociological work that's been done on divorce by Nicholas Christakis at Yale University and his colleagues. And what they find is that if your best friend gets divorced, if your sister gets divorced, your odds of divorce skyrocket. By contrast, if your best friend doesn't get divorced, even when she's in the middle of a difficult chapter in her marriage, and when your sister doesn't get divorced, even if she's really super frustrated at her husband, then of course your odds of divorce go down precipitously. So the point I'm getting at here is that sociologically we understand and appreciate that our marriages, this is a kind of profoundly un-American point to make, right? But that our marriages really depend to an important extent on our friends and our families and our communities, and sort of where we locate ourselves and the kinds of virtues and ideals that are kind of embedded in those communities. So in our case, that is in Danielle and my case, when you think about kind of the norms and called the nomos, that's sort of like the supernatural sacred canopy that sort of is cast over you, and the networks, these are all sort of factors that help to explain why folks who are religious tend to be more likely to flourish in their marriages. And I'll just mention in terms of norms like fidelity, for instance, and forgiveness, a nomos in terms of like making sense of life's difficulties, of the slings and arrows of misfortune that can confront us, things like the loss of a job, cancer, a very difficult child. Having a faith helps you navigate these things more readily as a spouse. And then social networks, again, sort of the friends. So when Danielle and I had twins, or I should say Danielle had twins 13, actually be clear and correct here. When Danielle had twins 13 years ago, we already had 5 kids at home. And we were a little overwhelmed at that point. And we were really fortunate to have, I think, about a month's worth of free meals brought to our home Monday through Friday in those 4 weeks after we had our twins. It's kind of an example of how a social network, in this case, associated with kind of a religious community here in Charlottesville was pretty helpful in navigating the challenges of marriage and family life. Okay, so beyond my own experience, what's sort of the data tell us? What we see, for instance, in my work with colleagues on women's marital happiness is that women who are more religious are the most likely to report that they're doing well in their marriages, as this slide here suggests on the right. And even when we kind of look at patterns in the sexual arena, we see, which obviously is pretty important in our culture in terms of like what's sort of valued in American life today. We see even kind of in this domain that folks who are religious are more likely to have frequent sex compared to their non-religious peers. Kind of surprising, I think, probably for many of us to see these kinds of trends in the data. And then also more likely to say that they're happy with their the sexual dimension of their marriage as well. Okay? And this might be right because, in part, things like commitment and trust and sort of endowing sex with some kind of significance actually tend to reinforce better sex as well. And then in terms of marital stability, what we see is that folks who are attending church regularly are between about 30 and 45% less likely to get divorced. This is a study by Tyler Vanderweel at Harvard, who's been tracking a very large sample of women in America over time, and this is kind of his story there on the right with respect to divorce, like a reduced risk of divorce for Tyler Vanderweel in this study. Now, I want to be careful and clear here to suggest, or to acknowledge, I should say, that faith is not a panacea. I'm not saying to you that if you go to church or pray regularly that, things are going to be, completely magical in your marriage. It's obviously not true. And to be more kind of precise, what my own research suggests is that about 1 in 5 folks who are regularly attending church with their spouse are not happy at any one time. So if you walk into a church on Sunday, folks have the game face on, hopefully most times, and they look pretty good, trying to kind of get through church with maybe the kids, but they're not going to kind of maybe betray their thoughts of anger or disappointment or even despair. So I just want to be kind of clear here. I'm acknowledging that there are plenty of times and plenty of folks who struggle, even though they are faithful. Struggle in their marriages. But at the same time, it's important to acknowledge and appreciate that in general and on average, religious Americans are more likely to be happily married, and they're more likely to be stably married, is what the research tells us about the relationship between religion and family life. And so again, the point here is that as folks are in college, they should be, I think, more appreciative of the ways in which plugging into a faith community can help set them up for kind of longer-term success when it comes to marriage and family. So to conclude here, in a culture that's kind of increasingly dominated, by resume virtues rather than eulogy virtues, and in a culture where kind of the family, where marriage, where fertility are all in retreat, and where folks are unhappier today than they were, say, 30 years ago. Maybe this is in part because too many college students and too many adults in the U.S. more generally are making mistakes regarding kind of how they think about love, how they approach sex, and how disconnected they've become from faith. So if we're interested kind of in renewing the pursuit of happiness, to bring that idea back in from the beginning, that Jeffersonian pursuit, if you will, that quintessentially American undertaking, pursuing happiness, if we're concerned with that, and I think a lot of people here are concerned given our hands at the beginning of the lecture, perhaps it's time to get countercultural about love, sex, and faith, both in college and then beyond that as well. So that's it, and I'm happy to take questions you might have or comments as well.